Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's Middle East political talk show. Very recently, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu broke with American protocol and delivered a speech before the US Congress without consulting the White House first. Mr. Netanyahu criticized the Obama administration, saying its efforts to negotiate a deal with Tehran will not prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. It would all but guarantee that Iran gets those weapons. Speaking of protocols, some Lebanese political factions accused the US ambassador of breaching protocols over Iran. But what is this telling us about the US policy in Iran and its relations with Israel and the Arab states? Let me first welcome our guests here at the studio, Dr. Mohammed Haidar, Lebanese political analyst, welcome back on the show, and Mr. Rafael Marcus, researcher at King's College in London, welcome back as well.
Thanks.
Before we get into our discussion today, let's have a look at this brief report.
Last week, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the US Congress after US House Speaker John Boehner invited him to address a joint session and discuss the threat from Iran. Boehner announced the invitation to Netanyahu the day after President Obama gave his State of the Union address and asked Congress to hold off on additional sanctions on Iran while the negotiations were ongoing. Democrats said they refused to attend the Israeli Prime Minister's address to a joint meeting because it was a partisan event convened by Republicans to undermine President Obama. Netanyahu told American lawmakers that the Obama administration was wrong to be negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program, describing the Islamic Republic as a terror state that threatened world peace through its proxies around the world, including its lackeys in Lebanon. Around 60 Democrats boycotted Netanyahu's speech, many casting their absence as a protest against Speaker John Boehner, not the Prime Minister. Republicans rose to Boehner's defense, saying Netanyahu's speech was an important message about the dangers of Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Iran's parliamentary speaker Ali Larijani condemned Netanyahu's speech as a foul spectacle intended to spread fear and said it was a disgrace for Israel. Meanwhile, in Beirut, Hezbollah hit back at US Ambassador to Lebanon David Hale for breaching international standards of conduct and diplomatic norm, after he accused Hezbollah of making life and death decisions for all of Lebanon and violating UN Security Council resolutions. The militia likened Hale's remarks to a speech delivered by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu before Congress. On the other hand, analysts have accused Hezbollah of being fired up over the American ambassador's remarks, while they tolerate Iranian diplomats stating Iran's borders extending to South Lebanon.
Mr. Marcus, to what extent is the breach of protocol the issue for the White House, especially when compared to the aim or the content and context of the Congress speech of Mr. Netanyahu?
Well, I'd say it's really both of these factors. The breach of protocol is highly unusual that a head of state of a foreign country should be invited by somebody other than the president to address Congress. This is an unusual diplomatic protocol and was deemed insulting and provocative by the Republican leader to invite Netanyahu. On the other hand, the content of the speech itself was also deemed insulting. You had Secretary of State John Kerry just the other day on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, give remarks to something to the effect of that the fact that people are commenting on a deal that isn't signed yet and isn't public yet, and that the details aren't released yet, is a bit quick on the trigger. And secondly, that it's, quote, insulting and presumptuous that people don't believe the United States president when he says that the U.S. won't allow Iran to get a bomb. He actually used the word, it's insulting that people don't take him on his word that a U.S. presidential commitment is not enough.
And do you think Mr. Obama would have attended where the protocols observed on this occasion?
I mean, in the past, the vice president, president have attended Prime Minister Netanyahu's speeches. I mean, I think if it would have been properly dealt with and through the proper diplomatic channels, it could have been done. It was done twice in the past.
What about the timing? Because they usually refrain from getting into such speeches before elections in Israel.
So it's a great point that the U.S. has historically avoided, quote, meddling in other countries' affairs close to election periods to prevent influencing the outcome. And given it was 2-3 weeks away from Israeli elections at the time, now that you mention it, he would have probably refrained from getting involved. And he countered that Netanyahu should have not even come to the United States, given how close it was to an election period.
Dr. Mohammed Haidar, in his speech, Mr. Netanyahu says, quote, "For those who believe that Iran threatens the Jewish state but not the Jewish people, listen to Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, Iran's chief terrorist proxy. He said, if all the Jews gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of chasing them down around the world," unquote. Now, Dr. Haidar, what's your take on that?
Going back to the question, the first question, Netanyahu, when he meant to go to the United States, the main purpose of that, first of all, to cause damage to the Obama administration, to show that he is uncredible
As a
president, and his administration is not really doing well, for the United States of America and its allies, the Israelis. So, he was capable. Obama was capable of dealing with it very delicately and smoothly. And the counterattack was, you remember during the speech, 60 of Obama's congressmen did not attend the speech, which is really, and the president himself. So this was like, okay, you got what you want, and we don't need more than that. And when he raised the question for him, okay, what's the solution? He knows what the solution. There is no solution apart from political solution at the moment. This is because of Iran has proved itself as a power can deal in details with any issue in the Middle East without any damage and without causing any damage even for the American. Right. So that was really Obama like. Going back to the Jewish people, you have to remember, look, everybody knows that the Israelis are really hitting Lebanon all the time since like 60 years. None of the Lebanese were gone and invade any of the of the Israeli territories or occupied places.
All the Lebanese take is on the wording of
look, whatever Netanyahu is trying to do, he tried to do it, in Paris as well after the Charles Hebdo.
Yes.
He invited himself. He wasn't invited for the march. He wasn't invited with those people. He forced himself.
Yes.
And the moment he went there, then he started to say, look, the Jews are under threat.
But
blah,
back to
blah.
Hezbollah.
And then look, it's surprisingly, and then as if he's telling people, go and hit the Jews. So this is what I'm saying is right, and that raises a question about the role of Obama and his intelligence service there.
And back to Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah's wording on gathering the Jews in Israel, so it saves the trouble chasing them elsewhere.
Look, there is a prophecy in the Old Testament.
Yes.
And the Natura Party, Jewish group knows that. The moment all the Jews, this is what they say, I'm not saying that. The moment all the Jews gather there, then this will be the end of Israel. That's why the Natura Carta people, which are really like very conservative Jews, they hate the idea of establishing Israel because of that. This is their prophecy.
But isn't it valid for the Prime Minister to take it as a threat?
Whatever, Nasrallah said, he is in his country and he's defending his land.
Yes.
Right? The moment, there was no Hezbollah a few years ago. 10, 15 years ago, there was no Hezbollah, there was no Hassan Nasrallah, but the Israelis, they were still there and they were hitting, and they were hitting our land day and night, and what can the Lebanese do, So this is their choice,
And now I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Toby Green, joining us from Tel Aviv, political analyst, writer and lecturer specializing in Israel, the Middle East and Israel's international relations. Welcome to our discussion today with my guests here at the studio, political analyst Dr. Mohammed Haidar and researcher Rafael Marcus of King's College. Dr. Green, you tweeted on Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, quote, "Interesting that Netanyahu did not insist on zero enrichment as in the past, rather a great rollback than in current proposals," unquote. Tell us more, why is this interesting and how?
Well, I think this was an element of the speech. If you look past the politics and actually the content of what Netanyahu is saying, this was an element of the speech that I think was widely overlooked. In the past, Netanyahu has maintained a very strict line that Israel's position is that Iran should not be allowed any enrichment capacity whatsoever. And some have criticized that even in Israel as perhaps being, unrealistic. Certainly outside of Israel, that's been criticized as being an unrealistic demand. If you listen to Netanyahu's speech closely, this time he took a different position. He talked about rolling back the program further. He did not talk about an insistence on zero enrichment, even though UN Security Council resolutions insist on complete cessation of enrichment. So it looked to me as though, if you set aside all the political bluster and all the rest of it, if you look closely at what Netanyahu was saying, was he was actually adopting not a completely uncompromising position, but a slightly more pragmatic position. And what he was saying was he was not laying down impossible conditions that would make any deal impossible. He was saying the deal that's being considered right now is inadequate. It should be tougher, it must be tougher, and it can be tougher if the P5+1, led by the United States, drive a harder bargain. They have the leverage to do so. Iran is in a tough spot. It's under heavy pressure from sanctions, and the P5+1 should demand more. They need to push Iran further back from the capacity for nuclear weapons in the short term and not give them unlimited right to enrich uranium and develop their nuclear program in the long term if their regional behavior doesn't change. And I think that there was a certain degree of credence to that case.
Yes, and Dr. Green, then in the Huffington Post you state many commentators have dismissed the speech as containing nothing new and as offering no alternative. But there was something new, you say, an apparent concession, in fact, and a strategy. Tell us more about these.
Well, as I say, I think the new element was, rather than making an absolute insistence on zero enrichment, the new element was to say we should push Iran further back, we should roll back the program further than the current proposal proposes. A lot of people did criticize Netanyahu as offering no alternative, and I don't read it exactly that way. I think what Netanyahu was saying is you have to be prepared to walk away from the negotiating table or say no if the terms of the deal that the other side want are not acceptable and don't meet your basic requirements. And you have to have an alternative to a negotiated deal. If you don't have any alternative, then you're going to be taken advantage of at the negotiation table. So there has to be a plan B in the pocket of the US and the P5+1 if the Iranians are not willing to make the concessions necessary to reassure the world that it can't get its hands on nuclear weapons. And that plan B is to toughen up sanctions and put more pressure on Iran until they're willing to make the concessions.
Yeah, but there is no alternative, with Netanyahu. He doesn't have. The only alternative for Netanyahu is to go and wage a war,
No, if you listen to his speech, that's not
if
what
he
he
comes,
said.
with an alternative, definitely,
No, if you listen to his speech, that's not what he said. What he said was the alternative to the current deal is a better deal. And how do you get a better deal? Is you seek to increase the pressure. So I think it's not the case. The ones who military action is certainly an option that Israel is not ready to dispense with, because Iran with nuclear weapons is an intolerable threat to Israel's national security. But also a military response would be a last resort for Israel, because Israel would pay a heavy price for any military action. I live here in Israel, and it would be the rockets from Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Iran's other proxies, and Iran itself would be falling on my home, and it would be sirens going off in my town if that military action has to take place. But nonetheless, Israel is not going to dispense with that option, because the threat that Iran, a country which declares its intention over and over again to destroy the state of Israel, might have nuclear weapons, is intolerable. And although many Israelis don't agree with the way Netanyahu handled his visit politically, most Israelis do agree with the central message that he took to the US.
And
yeah,
Dr.
but
Green,
scientifically, can I comment? Scientifically, we should realize that. I think, the Iranian know the option with the nuclear weapon is a more disastrous for them. Taking in consideration, many incidents happened before, like Chernobyl, and lately in Fukushima in Japan. That has damaged, caused a great deal of damage, for Europe and Japan. We still don't know the real or the impact of the damage the Fukushima, has caused to Japan and the islands around, and there is some kind of a secrecy, about that. And I don't think, Iran, where that the most earthquakes might happen, in Iran, they knows about that. So if they want to develop really a serious weapon, it might damage them, more than others. That's why I believe that their nuclear capability is for energy, which is really the most important for them. And there is no shred of evidence, proof that they are going toward, developing any nuclear weapon. And we shouldn't forget that Netanyahu, who is trying to promote this, the Iranian have reached the 90%, of the knowledge of doing this. I think, if the Iranians want to do that, during, the dissociation of the USSR, they had the opportunity to maybe, buy most of the nuclear head from these countries.
Yes, Dr. Green?
If I may, could I respond to that?
Yes, of course.
The reasons you've given why it's crazy and unnecessary and dangerous for Iran to develop a nuclear power plant prove exactly why people are so suspicious of its nuclear power program. This is a country which sits on 10% of the world's oil, which has vast natural gas resources. Why on earth would a country like that, with all those resources, take all the risks of developing nuclear energy, civilian nuclear energy, when it has so many alternative energy resources at its disposal? This is why people, one of the many reasons why people assume the only reason why Iran would want to do that and take those kind of risks is because its real goal is nuclear weapons. And it's simply not true to say there's no evidence of Iran developing nuclear weapons. And I encourage anybody who doubts this for one moment to read the November 2011 IAEA report. That is the UN agency, the International Atomic Energy Agency's report, which just demonstrates in words, black and white, replete with evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. And this is an extremely cautious international body that does not leap these conclusions suddenly. So the idea that there's no evidence is absolutely crazy. Iran has been caught red-handed developing nuclear facilities in secret time and again. It's absolutely clear that their goal is to get nuclear weapons or to be within reach of nuclear weapons, and that is extremely dangerous, not only for Israel, but for the entire Middle East.
I'd have to agree with Dr. Green that the notion that Iran has never illustrated an interest in a military nuclear program is simply false. They've been caught, quote, red-handed on at least 3 occasions by the IAEA. In several damning reports. And just recently there was an initial briefing given by the head of the IAEA who said that he had a lot of problems, a lot of concerns with Iran's openness regarding its military capability, the military aspects of its nuclear program. Not to mention, you had a statement from the former head of the IAEA, I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong, with Ali Heinlein, who said that on 2 occasions the IAEA has been surprised by Iran's secretive military programs, one in Natanz and one in Qum, that the IAEA hadn't been aware of, and these were surprises. And these.
But the same people, they said that Saddam Hussein had nuclear capability, and this doesn't prove anything. This is just oh, you are accused of this, but there is no proof that you are the criminal. They can say whatever they want, but there is no proof at the moment. While Israel has at least 8% of the nuclear capability in the world. That means over 200 nuclear heads.
Making it up? Are the people that write IAEA reports making it up? Are they lying?
Dr. Green, we've seen, let's get back a little bit to Israeli politics. We've seen Mr. Netanyahu enjoying good vibes at the Mahani Yehuda Souk in Jerusalem on March the 9th, although the market is traditionally viewed as one of the Likud's strongholds. Now, how are the repercussions of Mr. Netanyahu's speech? How are they affecting his popularity in Israel?
Well, in fact, the latest development in Israel, the polls in the last 2 to 3 days have actually shown a significant drop in support for Netanyahu's Likud party. That's been the big news of the last 2 to 3 days. So it doesn't look like his trip to the United States really did him any good whatsoever. Truth be told, it probably didn't make a huge difference either way. But for some reason or other, there are many possible explanations. Likud has seen a significant fall-off of support in the last few days, and suddenly the Likud finds that it's trailing its main rival, the Zionist Union center-left bloc, by 3 to 4 seats. So if we continue this way into the election, usually elections throw up more surprises and usually defy the predictions of the pollsters. So we have to be cautious about predictions in Israeli politics. But it looks at the moment like the Zionist Union party led by Tzipi Livni and Yitzhak Herzog will come out the largest party. though that does not necessarily mean that they will be able to form a coalition. So there are many, many complex factors in play that will, and a long, long way to go before we work out who will actually lead Israel's next government.
Dr. Toby Green, also Deputy Editor of BICOM's Fathom Journal, joined us from Tel Aviv, and you're also the visiting scholar at Tel Aviv University and the author of Blair, Labour and Palestine, Conflicting Views on Middle East Peace After 9/11. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Mr. Marcus, President Obama said Netanyahu did not offer any viable alternatives to the nuclear negotiations with Iran. Now, does the US President usually obtain such alternatives just by being mentioned from a speech that he didn't even attend? Or was he expecting even Mr. Netanyahu to formulate a win-win deal where everyone's happy?
Well, I think the notion that Netanyahu was going to lay out a detailed nuclear plan of something that would be suitable to Israel and to the U.S. in a public forum is silly. But I think the root of the issue is really what Netanyahu put forward. And as Dr. Green mentioned in the previous conversation, Netanyahu says that the current deal is a bad deal, and he says the alternative does not need to be war, does not need to be a strike, just needs to be, quote, a better deal. Now, he didn't give the details of this better deal, and actually, Netanyahu was criticized by many of retired Israeli security establishment for confronting the U.S. president in this way. They said that Netanyahu and whatever alternative plan he seeks could be much better put forth in a private setting. Not to mention, there's much more subtle ways that the Israeli government can influence U.S. policy than trying to give a speech across the television screens of everybody.
Do you think, Dr. Haidar, the same way? And do you think, speaking about the tone of the speech, do you think the Republicans fueled it on this occasion?
I think the tone of the speech was very aggressive.
In what sense?
Just
because America is a bigger state, or?
No, because he thinks, he can go to the United States and dictate whatever he wants. And because some of the people are supporting, there are many, many congressmen support the Israeli policy in the area.
Right.
But it's not necessarily that you come and, it's being like a rude person, is coming and invading, the American, I would say, sovereignty. For a president to come like that, as if he's just walking in his garden. That's why the Americans they were really upset about it.
Well, we saw a lot of applaud at Congress.
Yeah, but look, he been showing his word all the time. He is repeating himself. That's why Obama, when he wanted to deal with it, he doesn't want to cause any damage to his image, his administration, to the American people, and the relationship between the United States and Israel. But he's showing him as like a stupid. He say, okay, we are doing this deal, we know how to do it with this deal. You don't have a deal. You don't have a plan. Your plan, we know it. We know what's your plan. Your plan is to go and do a strike all the time.
To stop the deal, basically.
No, he was trying, Netanyahu was trying, to raise the tension, between the people who are doing the negotiation with the Iranians.
Is it not valid?
And that's why they have a direct relationship with the French, and the French they're trying to put some obstacles, inside. But then the French, have been put aside by the Americans and say, look, you shut up. We know what we are doing. So you don't have to implement the Israeli policy inside the negotiation. And that's why the American administration, Kerry said that, we're not going to give you any details anymore. We were really kind enough to you, we're telling you what's happening, and but from now on, because you are causing a damage for the American strategy and the foreign policy, so we are not going to tell you any more details, and you are out. That's why Obama, he was upset. So he doesn't, but still, there are some people who are leaking information for him, and he said that, I know a lot. You see, Netanyahu, he said, I know all the details. It means, there are people who are leaking information for him. But nevertheless, this is going to happen. But Netanyahu, he realized that, that the Iranian now, the impact and, role in the Middle East is more and far, far behind, his expectation. It has been proved that, the only person or the only, country, it proved to be really a diplomatic country and know how to deal with issues from different aspects, from different directions, and under any circumstances, it was Iran.
Not sure Israel agrees.
No.
Anyway, back to internal politics in America. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi dismissed the speech recently of Prime Minister Netanyahu. She dismissed it as full of condescension and an insult to the intelligence of the United States. Where does this come from, in your opinion?
I mean, I think Nancy Pelosi's been a long-standing ally of Israel on Capitol Hill, and she said it brought her almost to the point of tears. That's a quote from after listening to parts of the speech.
Happy tears or sad tears?
No, sad tears, I'm afraid to say. And Netanyahu's breach of diplomatic protocol and I wouldn't say it's an attempt to sabotage the current deal, but that's a reason why the President Obama was so angry with the latest deal. He's saying that now the Iranians can use this as a chip in their bargaining strategy. I mean, I think that we really need to believe the U.S. President when he says that he's not going to allow the Iranians to develop a bomb. I think we need to take him at his word, at least before the details of the deal are put forward, and then everybody could judge.
But could the Republicans or anybody in America take the president at his word? No disrespect, of course, but I mean, he said a lot of things, for example, about Assad's days being numbered as of the first month of the uprising in Syria. And President Assad is still going on. He's probably staying in office and outstaying Obama, of course. So what do you have to say to that when it comes to respecting the president's words?
I mean, that's a good point, but President Obama never said that the United States will remove Assad, but what you're referring to is the red lines that he set regarding the use of chemical weapons.
Yes.
And then instead of launching military action with probably an inconclusive result, that Russian diplomatic initiative to remove the chemical weapons from Syria was put forward almost improvisationally. But at the end of the day, I think that's actually one of the successes of President Obama. I know this is a very contentious issue that people think that the red lines of Obama, he didn't keep his word, we can't trust him on anything. But I think history will judge that the fact that there are no more chemical weapons, at least from what we know, in Syria is a major success, and we didn't have to get the U.S. military involved in a large-scale campaign without clear political and military objectives.
Dr. Haidar, how would you assess the pitch?
But that was very clever, from the Syrian. So they realized that this is a dangerous issue, and they are going to use it against them in the United Nations, and they will be able, to inflame the whole situation and, encourage many people, many countries against them. So they said,
it's a compromise.
They realized, look, it's better for us to remove it.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been proved that, the Syrian regime have used the chemical weapons until now. There might, been some kind of weapons been used.
Very skeptical.
But it has been proved that the Daesh, who used that.
They went out of control, perhaps.
ISIS,
but let's get back to our subject today, let alone Syria. How would you assess the pitch of the speech of Mr. Netanyahu and its content, especially in its relation to Hezbollah?
Look, through the relationship between, Israel and America, there has been a great support, for Netanyahu, all over, under any circumstances. Even the American, during the last war against Lebanon by the Israeli, they opened the strategic, military, I will say, any kind of military weapon they have given them, all the strategic weapons in Israel has been given, to the Israelis. So there is more than such support, they're supporting them 100%. But David Hill, which is the
U.S. ambassador in Lebanon.
the US
we'll get to that.
ambassador,
We'll get to that.
The one thing, I wouldn't overemphasize this Hezbollah connection in Netanyahu's speech. He gave the example that Hezbollah and his Iranian proxy as an example to illustrate Iran's influence and a negative or nefarious influence across the Middle East. And he also spoke about the Houthis and the Shiite militias in Iraq and Hezbollah in Lebanon.
But this is nothing hidden. It's not something hidden.
No, it's not at all. But it was used as a rhetorical
nobody,
device.
not even Hezbollah is trying to dissociate himself, from Iran. Said Hassan Nasrallah, he was saying that, we are getting support from them.
Yeah.
So this is nothing new. What I'm saying is Netanyahu didn't bring anything new to amaze people. So that's why he was a loser in this speech.
Even
the Israeli,
his
even his
concern at
supporters,
such a very big platform.
look, there has been a lot of messages. If you remember, the last operation, the Israeli operation in Quneitra, against the Hezbollah group and the Iranian, Netanyahu sent a message through David Hill. He said, look, if the Hezbollah want to retaliate, we will hit them badly. So he sent a message. But what happened after that? They did the operation on his land, inside Israel. So what they did? They did nothing. They knew that you can't joke. If you use your weapon, okay, we are capable of using another weapon. And we did it from our land. This is what they said. And what can he do? Let him do whatever he wants now.
And now we are joined by Professor James Fetzer, former Marine officer, published widely on the theoretical foundations of scientific knowledge. Welcome back on the show.
Oh, it's my great pleasure to be here with you, especially when we're discussing such an important topic.
Thank you. In a piece published on Veterans Today, you argue Iran is not pursuing a nuclear weapons program. You state that the US intelligence and even the Israeli Mossad agree on that matter. Tell us more.
That's exactly right. All 16 U.S. intelligence agencies converged in the finding that Iran was not pursuing a nuclear weapons program in 2007, a conclusion they reaffirmed in 2011. Remarkably, even the Mossad concluded that Iran was not pursuing nuclear weapons in 2012, and yet only a few weeks later, Netanyahu appeared before the United Nations to claim precisely the opposite. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. We're dealing here with political theater. None of this is rooted in the facts as their own intelligence agencies have presented it.
And Professor Fetzer, you then state that Iran is entitled to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. So the US is violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But shouldn't there be exceptions when another state in the region, namely Israel, is threatened by Iran's nuclear ambitions?
But there's no reason for Israel to feel threatened. Israel has 200 to 600 of these little beauties. Israel has not signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel has not allowed inspectors. Iran, by contrast, has signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, has allowed inspectors, and is not pursuing weapons. Under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it is allowed to produce enriched uranium for the purpose of the peaceful use of electrical energy. I believe a background issue here is that Iran can produce fuel rods for the peaceful use of nuclear energy and sell them to third world nations cheaper than can the United States nuclear industry, which does not want the competition. The U.S. should not be violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has done nothing wrong, and it's outrageous that sanctions are being imposed on that nation, which the Geneva Conventions of 1949 declared to be a war crime.
Yes, we have another American here at the studio. We're lucky to have two of you today. Rafael Marcos, researcher at King's College, will interject on this note.
I mean, how do you explain the Iranian violation of the numerous IEA statutes and all the very damning reports issued by the IEA regarding Iran's non-compliance with inspections? Not to mention, you mentioned that Israel should not feel threatened. From an Israeli perspective, once to think about it, all the very belligerent and bellicose rhetoric from coming out of Iran, from the Ayatollah, and from others about wanting to wipe Israel off the map, to make Israel disappear, etc. I mean, if we want to look at it from their perspective, this is why they would feel concerned from an Iranian nuclear threat.
Well, I'm sorry to say you've been taken in by false translations. Ahmadinejad even didn't declare he wanted to wipe Israel off the map. What he said, properly translated, said, with time, this too, meaning this regime, will pass. And the Ayatollah, his remarks were similarly directed at regime change in Israel. Israel confronts no threat from Iran. It's simply preposterous. After all, ask yourself, what would Iran do if it had a bomb? It couldn't use it offensively without risking nuclear annihilation. Therefore, it could only be used defensively to let a nation that might attack Iran know that it may have to pay a cost. I'm afraid you've been taken in and played.
May I add something, if, let's suppose, Iran have a nuclear weapon, and want to use it against the Israeli, that will damage, all the Arab countries before Israel, and it will be the end of all these Muslim Arab countries. That's why it's impossible for the Iranian to do that. But the Israeli, they don't care, It's like Samson, they can destroy the temple on the head of each of everybody.
That was Dr. Haidar here, Mohammed Haidar from Lebanon. Do you agree, Professor Fetzer?
Well, I'd simply add that an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, which are only being used for peaceful purposes, even the Ayatollah Khomeini has reaffirmed the stance of Iran, which is nuclear energy for all, nuclear weapons for none, have been estimated to bring about the death of 1 million Iranians outright. And then as a cloud of contamination passed across Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, another 35 million more premature deaths. In other words, Bibi Netanyahu is willing to expend 36 million deaths to preserve Israeli domination, uncontested, of the Middle East. That's what this is all about. It has nothing to do with Iran pursuing a bomb it doesn't want and wouldn't use. It has to do with Iran's growing influence in the Middle East, which Israel wants to undermine.
Can I add something, please? Why Netanyahu is not worried about the Pakistani and their nuclear capabilities, which they have it already. And you have Taliban in that country, but nobody, raised any concern that Taliban might or have the capability of taking these weapons and use it. And until now, nobody even, raised a finger about that.
I mean, I think the Pakistani issue is a separate issue, and I think the U.S. and many of the Western powers are extremely concerned with that. But that's a separate issue.
No. It is an issue. You have the Taliban in Pakistan. You have the Taliban against the United States and against the Israelis and against so this is the direction. Is why they are capable of putting their hand, put their hand on chemical weapons in Syria and use it against people. And they are capable of taking these, nuclear warheads and use it. But nobody is raising concern about that. No, Netanyahu is completely shut up, about that.
Mr. Marcos?
He not even, mention it.
Well, I think regarding the case studies of other nuclear powers, Netanyahu did bring up in his speech. He brought up North Korea, which was given sanctions and all sorts of restrictions by the IAEA and was being monitored by all the Western powers. And in the end, we think has the sort of nuclear breakout or some sort of nuclear capability. So this is why Netanyahu wants to prevent, quote, a bad deal, because he thinks that the 10-year window that was part of this deal, the original 10 years where there would be restrictions, once it's lifted, would enable Iran to get a bomb.
Yeah, but we're talking about countries who have this capability already, not developing it. They have it.
I mean,
India and Pakistan have this capability already. They have the warhead,
I mean, there's no doubt about it.
We're talking about like what happened in Iraq. Iraq was invaded under the proposition that they have nuclear capability, and nothing happened.
I mean,
nothing.
No one here is proposing an invasion of Iran at the moment. Even the Prime Minister of Israel was not proposing an invasion, proposing, quote, a better deal.
Who knows?
I just think
it's a start with this step. You don't know when what is the consequence.
And I think the professor here on the line was, is in a way, is downplaying Iranian aggression around the region. This is something that is troubling the U.S. and is troubling Israel, is troubling all Western powers regarding Iranian influence in Iran and Yemen. I mean, this from the Israeli perspective, what Netanyahu brought up in his speech was sort of that Iran. And I actually think it's to try and put Iranian foreign policy and Iranian nuclear policy in the same bucket, you're never going to get a deal. So I think it's a mistake on his part. But that Iran's foreign policy will fall into line. While I think if the U.S. would be satisfied if a nuclear deal, a good deal was made, and I think Israel would be happy if a good deal was made, they'd be willing to overlook, so to speak, Iranian transgressions around the rest of the Middle East.
This is completely ridiculous. Iran isn't committing transgressions around the Middle East. Iran hasn't attacked any other nation since 1775. Interestingly, George Washington was only inaugurated in 1789, which means Iran has been at peace longer than the United States has existed as a nation. Netanyahu's better deal would be to obviate all capacity to enrich uranium, which would be a gross violation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel has not signed. Israel has a vast stockpile of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons it has never declared. The United States foreign policy strictly forbids foreign aid to nations with undeclared weapons of mass destruction. It's American hypocrisy that we continue to provide Israel with any foreign aid, which ought to be cut off. There's a problem with nuclear weapons in the Middle East, but it has nothing to do with Iran.
Professor Fetzer, let me quote something published on that matter. You say Netanyahu knows, no, it wasn't you actually, but it was a quote, Netanyahu knows he can get away with anything in America, unquote. That was Robert Fisk, of course. How could this be true when neither the US president nor his vice president attended Congress? And which American does Robert Fisk mean here?
Well, he's talking about the vast influence of AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee on Congress, well documented by Walton Mearsheim in their book, The Israeli Lobby. John F. Kennedy wanted to have AIPAC and its predecessor, the American Zionist Council, registered as foreign agents. That would have been an appropriate thing, but since his assassination, no American president has moved in that direction. It was an outrage, a violation of constitutional responsibility for the Speaker of the House to invite Benjamin Netanyahu to address the Congress, especially to attempt to subvert foreign policy being conducted by the American president with a P5+1. It's a disgrace. They are traitors. They have violated the Logan Act that forbids individuals from interfering with the foreign policy of the United States, and they ought to be tried for it.
But Republicans like John Boehner form a great part of the Congress. So in that sense, why not, even though you might not agree about the whole scenario?
I apologize, I couldn't quite hear.
I was saying Republicans and others like Mr. John Boehner, they form a big chunk of the Congress. So why not?
Well, the Zionist lobby exerts extraordinary influence. It's completely wrong. We have many joint dual U.S.-Israeli citizens, some in the Congress, others among the neopons who brought us 9/11, which was a complete outrage intended to reverse U.S. foreign policy from one in which, at least officially, we never attacked any nation that hadn't attacked us first, in order to draw us into the Middle East to attack these modern Arab states, to benefit and deconstruct them to benefit Israel and give it greater domination of the Middle East. That's what all of this is about. You had 47 Republican senators sign this outrageous doctrine, even including Mitch McConnell and Rand Paul from Kentucky. That's a disgrace. The American people aren't going to forget this.
Professor James Fetzer, also McKnight Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota Duluth and conspiracy analyst, joined us from Wisconsin. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
My great pleasure.
Thank you. Dr. Haidar.
I believe that the deal has been done, with the Iranians. And, at the moment, the American and the Iranian are, planning for something completely different. And this negotiation is just the umbrella. And there are many proof that, this will continue for a while until, the many issues settled. And I think, the Iranian has been given, let's say the password, just go ahead, and what's happening in Iraq, the military assistance and the technical assistance that are given, to the Iraqi army and all the military gathering, from here and there, it proved that, the Americans have no objection on it. Even what's happening in Yemen, the Americans have no objection on it. They didn't even move, their embassy to Aden, like the Gulf state they wanted to do. So they know what's happening. They know the capability of the Iranian of how to deal with issues like this. They are using their diplomacy in a very tactful way and a very successful. Starting, from the Taliban in Afghanistan, there has been a great deal, of cooperation, intelligence cooperation with the Iranian until today. And that what proved that, compared to other Arab countries, they have nothing to offer, They don't have any, they don't have any good diplomacy. They have no plans, they have no strategy, they have no policy, they have nothing, to offer except just to accept what other people dictating for them.
Mr. Marcos, just to comment on Professor Fedza's thoughts, basically, and without dismissing his thoughts, how many Americans, you've been back home recently, so does he represent the average mainstream American?
I mean, there's been a lot of thoughts, some accurate, some inaccurate, as well as some conspiracy theories. I'd like to touch upon all of them, but I don't think we have enough time for that. I mean, I think the professor who we just spoke to would definitely be in the minority opinion regarding. I mean, I think if I understood correctly, quite a few bombastic claims, not to mention some totally inaccurate conspiracy theories regarding 9/11, if I heard correctly. But I think to talk about what we were here to talk about originally was the speech in Congress. I think we have to, and he brought up some of the you brought up the role of the Republicans, and I think what we really have to understand here is that this breach of diplomatic protocol initiated by John Boehner is basically the Republicans using Netanyahu to stick it to the Democratic president. It's also Netanyahu using it for domestic
so it's
consumption.
win-win.
It's a win-win for the both sides. And not to mention, I do believe that the Iranian threat is a threat to the Middle East, is a threat to Israel, is a threat to the Sunni states.
Speaking of that threat, sorry to interrupt, Robert Bridge argues Netanyahu's speech left the impression of a helpless Jewish state on the verge of annihilation by a hostile neighbor. The article was in RT and it quotes Netanyahu saying, quote, Iran's regime poses a grave threat not only to Israel but also the peace of the entire world, unquote. Now, Our Russia Today observes the Israeli Prime Minister then made a stretch comparing the Islamic Republic of Iran to the most loathsome group of fundamentalists on the global stage today, which is the Islamic State. Now, speaking of threats, okay, but then is the comparison valid by Prime Minister Netanyahu? Comparing ISIS to Iran.
I mean, I think he used it again as a cheap rhetorical tool in a sense to illustrate the Sunni extremism and Shia extremism. I think Netanyahu does himself a disservice when he tries to compare ISIS to Iran or Hamas to ISIS, because there are fundamental differences, and glossing them over is not helpful or academically accurate. But what he is trying to illustrate is the Iranian extremism, the Iranian support of non-state actors, non-state groups, militant groups globally, and the threat that this poses to Israel. I mean, the connection to Hezbollah is undisputed. The connection to the connection to Hamas is undisputed. You had just today, I think, in Doha, Iranians meeting Hamas. The Houthi connection with Iran. So these are concerns these are issues that concern Israel and concern the United States. The thing is that a lot of Netanyahu's concerns are not necessarily concerns that the U.S. Republicans or Democrats don't share. They do share them. But his tactics, his mode of conveying that message was fundamentally flawed because it isolated the president.
I think it's good, from my point of view, if Iran, of Hezbollah, Hamas, all these, military groups, if they really form a threat to Netanyahu, I think this is good, because I don't think Netanyahu was making peace, in the Middle East. All the wars in the Middle East, Israel was behind it, all the wars,
Dr.
all
Haider,
the troubles,
back to Lebanon.
No, there is
Yes.
the difference when you talk about that. You are a threat, but I am causing the trouble. I am doing the war. The people who are doing the war are not a threat, but when you become really strong, trying to defend yourself, you become a threat. That's really ridiculous.
I don't think Iranian aid...
No. Iranian, not,
Hezbollah and Hamas don't help Lebanon or Gaza or the Palestinian Authority. They only do damage.
I'll tell you what, Hamas are defending their people. They are defending their people. This is their right. They are defending the people in Gaza and in Palestine.
Yes.
The Palestinians did not invade Israel in Europe. They did not invade. They did not take 90% of Palestine. This is their land.
Dr. Haider,
we have to realize that.
Yes. But
Now
back to our
90% of the Palestinian land is under the Israeli occupation.
Yes.
So what you're talking about? You're talking about the Palestinians are causing a threat. They are on 10% of their land.
But
that's what's ridiculous.
Getting back to neighboring Lebanon, where Hezbollah perceived as the closest threat to Israel, How would you look at the criticism of Hezbollah and even the House Speaker Nabih Berri over what they deemed a breach of protocol in Lebanon when the American ambassador David
the American
Hale
ambassador is
attacked
stretching his
Hezbollah?
nose, he is causing division in Lebanon.
He's a diplomat, he can say things.
Not diplomat. This is not diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't create division, in the country. You go and support this from here, and you try, to create more divisions. Right. They are causing more troubles, for the country instead of, bringing like a good initiative for the country. Is the American, helping Lebanon? How could the American are helping Lebanon? Tell me, by helping the Israeli to invade Lebanon?
But
Why can't they see the Israelis, plane are, flying over Lebanon, there are over 60,000, fly, from them over Lebanon. What that mean?
But what
are they just, making a picnic in our land?
I hear you, definitely. But what about the speeches of Iranian officials on their visits to Lebanon when they state that the borders of the Republic of Iran stretch to Lebanon?
Yeah.
How is this not a breach of
sovereignty?
It doesn't mean
that okay, this is not physical. It means they have influence.
Yes, but it is still offensive to many factions.
Let it be offensive, who cares?
Oh, so basically...
Let it be offensive, let it be, let the Israeli feel the threat like my people in South Lebanon.
What about the Lebanese people?
No, we've been under their mercy, Let me tell you something. I came from a city called Sur. Sur has been destroyed by the Israeli planes, twice. What that mean? Are they making peace, in my land? And you're blaming, the Lebanese for getting help and assistance. The Israelis are getting the help and assistance of the American. Why they are not a threat?
I think the question
this
was
is our land,
to,
and we're defending our land.
I mean, all roads seem to go to this issue, but I think the question was referring to the dispute between the March 14 and the March 8 that was just even going on this week.
That's internal issue.
That's what he asked about.
Yeah, that's internal issue. But the American ambassador is interfering in this internal issue. You see, he's interfering. He is commanding people, like in 14th March, to do this and not do that. And he sent them text messages through many people, and this been proved.
I know the U.S. ambassador, the position in Lebanon is viewed with a lot of conspiracy and sensitivity.
No, he is actually doing this.
And you said you don't know what the U.S. does for Lebanon. Lebanon is a huge recipient of U.S. foreign aid. The LAF, the Lebanese army, is a huge recipient of military aid.
Where is this aid?
And I think the U.S. is invested.
No, tell me what kind of aid came to the Lebanese army. He said in his last speech, we support the Lebanese army. What kind of weapon he brought to the Lebanese army to defend its border against the Israeli and against ISIS? He did nothing. He brought some knives, and he brought some tractors, the second-hand tractor trucks being used by the American army, and some, very heavy, very light, weapons, which really, if you want, we can buy it, from Lebanon and give it back to him.
We respect all views, of course, but just as we end, Raphael, just your final say, where do you see this nuclear deal going? And do you see it something that President Obama wants to add to his legacy before his term in office is over, so as to compensate a little bit on what was seen as not a very successful policy in the Middle East?
I think there is no doubt the legacy factor there, but I think it genuinely, Kerry and Obama want to have a deal for the security of the United States, for the security of the Middle East, for the security of the region. They know the repercussions of what would happen if it didn't happen. I think we just have to keep this in context of, I don't think the rift between the U.S. and Israel is so great. I think this is cheap political posturing that will pass. But I think the bigger rift is between the Republicans and the Democrats. And that, I think, is
which was displayed, really, throughout Netanyahu's speech.
Displayed there. It's one of many issues. Do you want to think the Department of Homeland Security was actually withheld funding by the Republicans very briefly because of budgetary fighting on immigration between Democrats and Republicans. We want to keep that in mind. There's constant fighting between the Republicans and Democrats, and this is what's damaging for the U.S.
There is an Iranian, suggestion that they can bring the division,
I saw today. I'm
them,
sure the U.S. will take it very seriously.
The Iranian will do this initiative to really bring them together.
Well, on this note, as this episode comes to an end, let me thank our guests here at the studio, Dr. Mohammed Haidar, Lebanese political analyst, and Mr. Raphael Marcos, researcher at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Dr. Toby Green, who joined us from Tel Aviv. He's the research director of BICOM in Israel. And let me also thank Professor James Fetzer, who joined us from Wisconsin, philosopher of science and conspiracy analyst. Thank you very much for all the guests. And so let me get this right. Iran would definitely benefit when sanctions are lifted. Israel was given a full charm offensive at Congress, just not at the White House. Hezbollah remains a great threat to Israel, and the Prime Minister of Israel compared the group to ISIS. The Republicans were largely for a crackdown on ISIS and the Muslim Brotherhood, something the President did not entertain. So will agendas of friends and foes overlap at some point? I'll leave it there. Stay tuned and we'll be with you again soon on Straightforward Levant TV. Bye for now.